The halls of Jefferson Academy smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money. Framed photographs of past graduating classes lined the walls, rows of smiling faces. Almost all the same shade, dressed in pressed blazers and confidence. Malik Carter walked those halls every morning with measured steps, his backpack snug against his shoulders, his eyes taking in everything without lingering too long on any one thing. He had learned early that looking around to openly invited questions, and questions invited assumptions. At 10 years old, Malik had mastered the art of quiet observation. He noticed who spoke the most in class and who never had to raise their hand to be called on. He noticed how some kids talked about their summer homes as if everyone had one, and how teachers nodded along as though it were perfectly ordinary. He noticed how his own name sounded different in certain mouths, stretched, slightly, softened unnecessarily, like something fragile. Ms. Anderson's classroom was immaculate, every surface curated. Motivational quotes in elegant frames lined one wall, each attributed to a president, philosopher, or business magnate. Her desk was free of clutter, a single leather planner placed just so. She stood at the front of the room as the bell rang. Posture perfect, honey blonde hair pulled into a sleek bun that never seemed to move. Ms. Anderson was admired by parents and administrators alike. She had taught at Jefferson Academy for over 20 years and wore that tenure like a badge of honor. She believed she understood children, believed she could tell who they were going to be long before they knew themselves. Today, she announced, her voice smooth and practiced, "We'll be doing short presentations about your parents' careers. It's important to understand the world you come from and how it shapes you." The room buzzed immediately. Malik sank slightly into his chair as whispers flew across the aisles. He already knew what most of them would say. Venture capitalists, attorneys, lobbyists, consultants, titles that sounded heavy and impressive. Even when spoken by children, Ms. Anderson scanned her tablet. "We'll go in alphabetical order," she said. "Carter, you're first." Malik felt his stomach tighten, but he stood. He had rehearsed this in his head the night before, keeping his words simple. Careful not to say too much. His father always told him that details mattered, and that some details were not meant for public spaces. He walked to the front of the room, the floor suddenly feeling much farther away than it had moments before. 24 faces turned toward him, some curious, some bored, a few already amused, as if they expected entertainment. "My name is Malik Carter," he began, his voice steady despite the faint hum in his ears. "My dad's name is Jonathan Carter. He works at the Pentagon." The silence that followed was brief but sharp, like the intake of a collective breath. Then a soft laugh escaped from somewhere near the windows. Another followed. Malik didn't look at them. He kept his eyes forward. Ms. Anderson tilted her head slightly, lips curving into a small, indulgent smile. "Not cruel, not angry, just knowing. The Pentagon," she repeated, as though tasting the words. "That's quite a place, Malik." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "He works in, and what does he do there?" she asked, her tone light. "Conversational." "Too light." "He works in security," Malik replied. "Operations." Ms. Anderson nodded slowly, tapping her stylus against her tablet. "I see." She glanced briefly at the class, then back at Malik. "You know, it's very common for children to misunderstand or embellish their parents' jobs, especially when those jobs sound impressive." The smile stayed on her face, but something in her eyes cooled. A few students snickered openly now. Malik felt heat creep up his neck. "I'm not embellishing," he said quietly. "That's really where he works." Ms. Anderson raised an eyebrow, just slightly. "Of course," she said. "Well, thank you for sharing, Malik. You may take your seat." He hesitated, waiting for her to ask something else, to give him a chance to explain further. She didn't. The dismissal was gentle, polite, and absolute. As Malik walked back to his desk, the whispers followed him like a current. "The Pentagon," someone murmured. "Sure." Another voice added, "Maybe he cleans there." He sat down, hands folded tightly in his lap, his heart thudding harder with each passing second. Ms. Anderson had already moved on, calling the next student with the same warm authority she always used. The room had shifted. He could feel it. The air felt thinner, charged with something unspoken. For the first time since he'd started at Jefferson Academy, Malik understood that it wasn't just about fitting in, it was about being believed. And in that moment, standing alone at his desk while the class carried on without him, he realized that belief was something not everyone was given freely, not even when they were telling the truth. The laughter didn't follow Malik home that afternoon, but the silence did. It sat with him in the backseat of his father's car, thick and unmoving, stretching between the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the turn signal. Malik watched the city blur past the window, the familiar landmarks of Washington, D.C. feeling suddenly distant, like props in a world he wasn't fully allowed to claim. Jonathan Carter noticed. He always did. "You're quiet," his father said at last, eyes still on the road. Malik shrugged without looking up. "Just tired." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Jonathan didn't press, not yet. He had learned, through years of interrogations and debriefs far more dangerous than this moment, that silence often said more than words, so he waited. At home, Malik dropped his backpack by the door and went straight to his room. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat on the edge of his bed, replaying the moment again and again, the pause after he said Pentagon, the way Ms. Anderson's smile had shifted, how the room had tilted without anyone physically moving. Downstairs, Jonathan stood in the kitchen, loosening his tie. His phone buzzed once, then again. He glanced at the screen, an internal alert, not urgent but unusual. Jonathan frowned. He hadn't expected any flags today, not after weeks of routine monitoring, but the alert wasn't about him directly. It was tagged to a location, Jefferson Academy. Jonathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Upstairs, Malik lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling. He had always known Jefferson was different. His classmates talked about power like it was inherited, something absorbed at birth along with their last names. Malik had believed naively. He realized now that truth alone was enough to bridge that gap. He hadn't expected Ms. Anderson to believe him outright, but he hadn't expected her to smile like that either, as if she already knew who he was, as if she had placed him into a box so small there was no room for truth inside it. At dinner, Malik picked at his food. "How was school?" Jonathan asked casually, spearing a piece of chicken. Malik hesitated. "Then we had presentations about parents' jobs." Jonathan paused mid-motion. "And I said you work at the Pentagon." Jonathan looked up, and Malik swallowed. They laughed. Jonathan set his fork down slowly. "Who? Some kids." Malik's voice was careful now. "Practiced. The teacher too. Kind of." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying his son. "Kind of." She smiled, Malik said. "Like I was making it up." The room went very still. Jonathan didn't raise his voice, didn't show anger, but something cold and precise settled behind his eyes. "What did she say?" "That kids exaggerate sometimes," Malik replied. "That we misunderstand our parents' jobs." Jonathan nodded once. "And you?" "I told her it was true." Malik finally looked up. "She didn't believe me." For a moment, Jonathan said nothing. Then he reached for his phone. Malik noticed. "Dad?" Jonathan stopped, the phone hovering just above the table. He looked at Malik, really looked at him, the tightness in his shoulders, the restraint in his voice. A 10-year-old trying to sound older than he should have to. "I need to check something." Jonathan said, "Finish your dinner, later." That night, Malik lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the creak of the stairs, the low murmur of his father's voice through the study door, the occasional pause, as if Jonathan were listening to someone on the other end of the line who mattered very much. Malik rolled onto his side. Outside, a car idled across the street. He noticed it because it hadn't been there earlier. A dark SUV, windows tinted, engine running but lights off. A man stepped out briefly, scanned the street, then got back in. Malik's heart began to pound. He slipped out of bed and padded quietly to his father's study. The door was partially open. "I'm telling you, the timing isn't coincidence," Jonathan was saying, voice low, controlled. "My son's school flagged the same way my systems did." "Yes, Jefferson Academy." Malik froze, asterisk. "I want eyes on the perimeter," Jonathan continued. "Discreet. And pull the faculty access logs." especially recent changes. Malik backed away silently, his chest tight. At school the next day, the air felt different. The laughter from yesterday hadn't disappeared, but it had sharpened. Whispers followed Malik through the hallway, not loud enough to report, not quiet enough to ignore. When he sat down in Ms. Anderson's class, she greeted him with the same pleasant professionalism as always. Almost. Her eyes lingered a fraction too long. "Before we begin," she said, clasping her hands, "I want to remind everyone that our classroom is a place for honesty and respect." A few students glanced at Malik. Someone smirked. Ms. Anderson turned toward him. "Malik, since you brought up the Pentagon yesterday, perhaps you'd like to tell us one verifiable fact about it." The emphasis was subtle, deliberate. Malik felt the room closing in, but something else stirred beneath the fear, something steadier. He had gone home and read everything he could. Facts, history, architecture, things no one could laugh away. "It has 5 sides," he said calmly, "and it was designed that way so no office is too far from the center." Ms. Anderson blinked, and Malik continued, his voice gaining strength. "It has more bathrooms than it needs because it was built during segregation." The class went quiet. Ms. Anderson's smile tightened. "Just barely. That's interesting," she said, though not especially relevant. Malik sat down, heart racing, but he had seen it. The crack. At lunch, his best friend leaned over. "You okay?" Malik nodded. "She wants me to be wrong." His friend frowned. "Why?" Malik didn't answer. Across town, Jonathan Carter stood in a secured conference room, eyes fixed on a digital map. A blinking marker hovered over Jefferson Academy. This started as a test, an analyst said. Low-level access attempts, probing. And now, Jonathan asked, now it's escalation. Jonathan folded his arms. "My son challenged a teacher yesterday," he said quietly. She laughed at him. The room was silent. Jonathan lifted his gaze. "They didn't follow me into that school." He straightened. They followed him. And for the first time since Malik had walked into Jefferson Academy wearing a borrowed confidence and a neatly pressed uniform, the truth was no longer just about being believed. It was about being protected. By the third day, the doubt had learned Malik's name. It followed him through the halls in the form of lowered voices and sideways looks. It lingered just long enough in conversations to make sure he felt it, then vanished before he could call it out. Jefferson Academy had mastered that kind of cruelty, never loud enough to be punished, never obvious enough to be denied. Malik felt it most in Ms. Anderson's classroom. She never raised her voice, never openly mocked him. That was what made it worse. Her disappointment felt curated, precise, like she had already written his story and was mildly annoyed that he kept trying to change the ending. That morning, she stood at the front of the room, hands folded neatly, posture flawless. "Today," she said, "we'll be discussing credibility, how we determine what information is reliable." The word landed like a stone. Malik's fingers tightened around his pencil. "In the real world," Ms. Anderson continued, pacing slowly, "not every claim deserves the same weight. Critical thinking means understanding context, background, probability." Her eyes drifted to Malik. "Sometimes," she added gently, "people say things because they want them to be true." A few students smiled. One whispered, "Not quietly enough, Pentagon." Malik felt the heat rise in his face, but he kept his gaze forward. He had learned something important since yesterday. Reacting gave them what they wanted, silence. When chosen was power. Ms. Anderson stopped beside his desk. "Malik," she said, voice soft, almost kind, "would you agree that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence?" The room leaned in. Malik looked up at her. For a moment, he considered saying nothing, letting her move on, letting this become another unspoken thing he carried home. But then he thought of his father's voice the night before, measured, careful, protective in a way that felt heavier now. "Yes, ma'am," Malik said. Ms. Anderson smiled, satisfied. "Good. Then perhaps you understand why it's difficult for some of us to take your claim at face value. Some of us, not you, not me, not the class, us." The bell rang sharp and sudden, breaking the tension. Students packed their bags, buzzing with energy. Malik stayed seated until the room emptied. His heart pounding with something he didn't yet have a name for. Ms. Anderson gathered her papers. "You may go, Malik." He stood, hesitated, then spoke. "I wasn't lying." She looked at him for a long moment. Not angry, not surprised, just unconvinced. "Of course," she said, "but perception matters." He walked out without another word. That afternoon, the school went into what they called a routine drill. Teachers ushered students into classrooms. Doors were closed. Blinds were half drawn. The announcement over the intercom was calm, practiced, reassuring. "This is a precautionary safety check. Please remain where you are." Malik noticed things others didn't. The unfamiliar man standing near the front gate, pretending to check his phone while watching the windows. The way Ms. Anderson's hand trembled slightly as she closed the classroom door. The fact that she locked it, something she'd never done during drills before. "Everything's fine," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a drill." Malik's tablet vibrated in his backpack. Once, then stopped. His breath caught. Across the city, Jonathan Carter stared at a screen filled with cascading data. His jaw clenched as alerts stacked faster than they could be dismissed. "This isn't random," he said flatly. "They're testing response times, mapping behavior." "On a school?" someone asked. Jonathan's eyes darkened. "On my son at Jefferson Academy." Ms. Anderson tried to resume her lesson, but the room had changed. The students felt it to the wrongness. The tension that crept in when adults pretended nothing was happening. Malik felt it in his bones. Ms. Anderson cleared her throat. "Let's take this opportunity to quietly read." A knock interrupted. Her sharp, authoritative. The classroom froze. Ms. Anderson opened the door a crack. A man in a dark suit spoke to her in a low voice. She nodded too quickly, then stepped aside. "Class," she said, forcing calm, "we're going to remain seated." But Malik wasn't listening anymore, because in the hallway beyond the crack in the door, he saw something that made his chest tighten. Men with earpieces, dark suits, purpose, and beneath the fear, beneath the confusion, something else surfaced: understanding. This wasn't about a presentation. This wasn't about being wrong or right. This was about why his father had warned him to be careful with the truth, and why some people laughed when they didn't believe you. Because believing you meant admitting the world was bigger and more dangerous than they were comfortable imagining. Ms. Anderson closed the door slowly. Her face pale now. She turned back to the class. "Everything is under control," she said. But her eyes betrayed her, and for the first time Malik realized something chilling and powerful all at once. She wasn't in control anymore, and whatever was coming next was going to expose far more than a lie that never existed. That night, the house didn't feel like home. It looked the same framed photos along the hallway, the same faint creak in the stairs when Malik climbed them, the same hum of the refrigerator downstairs, but something unseen pressed against the walls, tightening the air. Malik sensed it the way you sense a storm before the clouds arrive. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Ms. Anderson's voice in his head. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The way she'd said claims, like truth, was something borrowed, something Malik had no right to hold. Downstairs, Jonathan Carter stood in the darkened kitchen, the blue glow of his phone illuminating his face. He hadn't turned on the lights. Old habits. Lights made you visible. Visible made you predictable. The data scrolling across his screen wasn't classified yet, but it was troubling enough to make his jaw tighten. Repeated access attempts. Network pings bouncing through foreign proxies, all pointing back to a place that should have been invisible to anyone who mattered. Jefferson Academy. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. Schools were supposed to be soft places, safe places. He had spent his career making sure threats never reached places like that. And now one had done more than reach it. It had circled, tested, waited. Behind him, a floorboard creaked. Jonathan didn't turn. "You should be in bed," he said quietly. Malik froze halfway into the kitchen. "I couldn't sleep." Jonathan finally faced him. The hardness in his expression eased, just slightly. "Bad dreams?" "No," Malik said. Then, after a pause, "Do people ever not believe you?" Jonathan studied his son carefully. 10 years old. shoulders drawn in tighter than they should have been, too aware, too controlled. Yes, he answered honestly, all the time. Malik frowned, even when you tell the truth. Especially then. Malik nodded, absorbing that. My teacher thinks I made you up. Jonathan's lips pressed into a thin line. She doesn't think you made me up, he said. She thinks you made the job up. Why? Jonathan crouched so they were eye to eye. Because believing you would force her to admit she was wrong about something important. Malik hesitated. About me, Jonathan didn't answer. Right away, that, too, was an answer. Go back to bed, Jonathan said gently. We'll talk more tomorrow. Malik turned to leave, then stopped. Dad, yes, did I do something wrong? Jonathan's chest tightened. No, he said firmly. You told the truth. That's never wrong. Malik nodded and disappeared back upstairs. Jonathan waited until he heard the bedroom door close. Then he moved. He locked the back door, checked the windows, enabled a security protocol he hadn't used in years. His phone buzzed again, this time a direct line. I want eyes on the school, Jonathan said as soon as the call connected. No uniforms, no disruptions, just watch, a pause. Yes, he added, because my son is there, outside, across the street. An engine turned over softly. Malik saw it through his bedroom window. A black SUV sat where no car usually parked, its silhouette barely visible beneath the streetlight. He watched as a man stepped out, scanned the neighborhood, then lifted his wrist to his mouth as if speaking into it. Malik's heart began to pound. He backed away from the window and sat on his bed, hugging his knees. His father had said not to worry, had said everything was fine. But Malik was starting to understand something adults rarely admitted. Sometimes, fine was just another word for not yet. The next morning at school, Ms. Anderson was different. Not warmer, not colder, sharper. She moved through the lesson with efficiency. But her eyes flicked to the door more often than usual. She dismissed Malik's raised hand twice without acknowledging it. When another student repeated his answer, she praised. The insight, Malik noticed. So did the class. Power shifted in small ways first. At lunch, a boy leaned over and whispered, "Why would your dad work at the Pentagon anyway?" Malik met his eyes. Because that's where he works, the boy scoffed, but there was uncertainty in it now. That afternoon, Ms. Anderson stopped Malik as the class lined up. Parents' Day is Friday, she said pleasantly. Your father is welcome to attend. I'd love to meet him. The words were polite. The challenge underneath them was not. Malik held her gaze. He'll be there. Ms. Anderson smiled, but this time, it didn't reach her eyes. As Malik walked away, she stood very still, a faint crease forming between her brows. For the first time, doubt brushed against her certainty. Not about Malik, about something else. That evening, Jonathan Carter cleared his schedule, not officially, not on paper, but every instinct he had was screaming the same warning he'd learned to trust years ago. When people stop laughing and start watching, it's because they've realized the truth might be real, and real truths attract dangerous attention. By the time Malik went to sleep that night, there were 2 vehicles on the street, and inside Jefferson Academy's network, someone was already preparing for Friday. Not to prove a boy was lying, but to see what happened when the truth walked through the door. By Friday morning, Jefferson Academy felt like a stage set just before the curtain rose, every detail polished, every smile practiced, every interaction humming with anticipation. Parents' Day was not just an event here. It was a performance. Luxury cars lined the circular drive, engines purring softly as chauffeurs stepped out to open doors. Fathers in tailored suits checked their watches, while mothers adjusted sunglasses that cost more than Malik's entire winter wardrobe. Laughter floated through the air, light and confident, the sound of people who had never questioned whether they belonged in places like this. Malik stood near the entrance, hands clasped behind his back the way his father had taught him when he was nervous. He scanned the crowd instinctively, not looking for faces he recognized, but for absences. His father wasn't there yet. Relax, Ethan whispered beside him. Parents' Day always starts late. Malik nodded, but his chest felt tight. Ms. Anderson stood a few feet away greeting families with impeccable warmth, her posture flawless. her voice lilting with charm. She looked entirely at ease except for the way her gaze kept drifting toward the doors. She spotted Malik watching her and smiled. "Good morning, Malik," she said brightly. "Is your father parking?" "Yes, ma'am," Malik replied. "Wonderful," she said, drawing the word out slightly. "We'll begin shortly." The bell rang. Parents and students filtered into the classroom, filling seats and lining the walls. Conversations buzzed: business deals, policy discussions, quiet boasts wrapped in polite language. Ms. Anderson clapped her hands lightly. "Welcome, everyone. We're so pleased to have you here. Today is about community, transparency, and the values we pass on to our children." Malik sat in his seat, eyes fixed on the door. Ms. Anderson began calling on students one by one, inviting parents to stand and speak. Tyler's father spoke first, his voice booming with confidence as he described acquisitions and growth projections. Applause followed. Sophia's mother spoke next, referencing committees and legislation. More applause. Ms. Anderson beamed. Then she paused. "And now," she said, glancing deliberately at Malik's empty space beside him, "we'll hear from Malik Carter's family." A hush settled over the room. Malik stood slowly. "My father is," he began. The classroom door opened. The sound was soft, but it cut through the room like a blade. Every head turned. Jonathan Carter stepped inside. He didn't rush. He didn't announce himself. He wore a dark suit that was sharply pressed but unadorned. No designer logo. No unnecessary flourish. His posture was straight, his expression calm, his eyes alert in a way Malik had seen only a handful of times usually. Right before something serious happened, the room went silent. Jonathan paused just long enough to take in the space. The parents, the children, the teacher. Then he reached into his jacket, removed an identification badge, and clipped it neatly to his lapel. The effect was immediate. A few parents leaned forward. Someone inhaled sharply. Ms. Anderson's smile froze just for a fraction of a second, but Malik saw it. He saw the exact moment her certainty cracked. "Good morning," Jonathan said evenly. "I'm Jonathan Carter, Malik's father. Apologies for the delay." Ms. Anderson recovered quickly. "Mr. Carter, welcome," she said, though her voice had lost some of its effortless glide. "We were just—" "I understand," Jonathan replied, cutting in politely but firmly. "I hear there's been some confusion about my son's presentation earlier this week." A ripple moved through the room. Ms. Anderson straightened. "I wouldn't call it confusion," she said carefully, "more a misunderstanding. Children sometimes—" "My son doesn't misunderstand my job," Jonathan said calmly. He turned, slightly, addressing the room now. "I work at the Pentagon, specifically in national security operations." The silence deepened. Jonathan didn't raise his voice. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Ms. Anderson swallowed. "Of course," she said, the word suddenly brittle. "I simply wanted to encourage factual accuracy by suggesting my son was lying." Jonathan asked. The question was not loud, not aggressive, but it landed. A few parents shifted uncomfortably. One glanced at Ms. Anderson with new eyes. "I'm proud of Malik," Jonathan continued, "not because of where I work, but because he told the truth even when it cost him something." Malik felt his throat tighten. Ms. Anderson opened her mouth, then closed it again. At that moment, another knock sounded at the door. This one was firmer. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, followed by another. Both wore discreet earpieces. One leaned toward Jonathan and spoke quietly. "Sir, we need to speak with you now." Jonathan nodded once. He turned back to the room. "I apologize," he said. "Duty calls." Then, before leaving, he looked directly at Ms. Anderson. "Perception does matter," he said, "but facts matter more, and so does who we choose to believe." He stepped into the hallway with the agents. The door closed behind him. The classroom sat in stunned silence. Ms. Anderson stood frozen at the front, her authority suddenly fragile, her carefully curated certainty exposed. Malik remained standing, his heart pounding not with fear now, but with something heavier, vindication, and the dawning realization that his father hadn't come just to prove a point. He had come because something far more dangerous than disbelief had followed the truth into this room, and whatever it wasn't over. The door closed behind Jonathan Carter with a muted click, and the sound seemed to echo far longer than it should have. For a moment, no one moved. Parents sat frozen in their seats, hands folded in laps that had suddenly forgotten how to be confident. Students glanced between one another, unsure whether they were allowed to speak. Even the room itself felt altered, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. Ms. Anderson was still standing at the front of the classroom. Her smile was gone now, not replaced by anger or embarrassment but by calculation. She cleared her throat. "Well," she said lightly, far too lightly, "let's continue with the program." No one responded. Malik remained standing by his desk, his legs trembling just slightly. He hadn't meant to stay on his feet. He simply hadn't known when to sit back down. The world felt tilted, unreal, as though he'd stepped out of a story. He'd been trapped in and into one no one had prepared him for. Ms. Anderson noticed him then. Really noticed him. "Malik," she said, softening her tone. "You may sit." He did, slowly. As the class resumed, something fundamental had changed. Ms. Anderson still spoke with authority, but it no longer felt absolute. Her words landed, but they didn't command. Parents whispered to one another, some glancing at the door Jonathan had exited through, others watching Malik with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Ms. Anderson felt it all. She hated that she did. For years, she had prided herself on her instincts. She believed she could spot exaggeration, the way a sommelier identified a counterfeit wine, subtle notes out of place, a story that didn't quite breathe right. Malik had set off those instincts immediately, not because of what he said, she told herself, but because of how unlikely it sounded. A child like him, a father like that. And yet, her mind replayed the moment Jonathan Carter clipped that badge to his lapel, the quiet confidence, the way the room had responded to him without being asked to. Authority, real authority, did not need to announce itself, and she had missed it, where she had dismissed it. The classroom door opened again. This time it was the principal. He leaned toward Ms. Anderson and whispered something urgently. She felt the blood drain from her face. "Class," she said, her voice just slightly unsteady now, "we're going to pause for a moment. Please remain seated." Outside the classroom, Malik could see shadows moving past the small window in the door. Men in suits, women with tablets, voices low and clipped, efficient in a way that had nothing to do with school administration. His tablet vibrated in his backpack. Once, twice, then went still. Malik's pulse quickened. Ms. Anderson noticed his reaction. "Is something wrong?" she asked sharply. "No, ma'am," Malik said automatically. But she was already watching him differently now, not dismissively, warily. At lunch, Parents' Day was quietly suspended. Students were escorted in small groups. Parents were asked to wait. The explanation was vague, a security matter. Nothing to worry about. The kind of phrases meant to calm, but which only ever did the opposite. Ethan leaned close to Malik. "Your dad didn't look scared," he whispered. "No," Malik replied. "He doesn't when things are bad." That realization settled heavy in his chest. Across the building, Ms. Anderson sat alone at her desk, hands clasped so tightly her fingers ached. She stared at the attendance sheet. Malik's name circled faintly in pencil from earlier that week. She had thought she was teaching him a lesson. Instead, she had revealed one, not to him, to herself. The knock on her door came just after the final bell, firm, professional, unavoidable. She opened it to find the principal standing with two unfamiliar adults. "Ms. Anderson," the principal said, avoiding her eyes, "we need to ask you a few questions." Her heart stuttered. "About what?" she asked. "About access," one of the strangers said calmly. "About assumptions, and about what you may have overlooked." Ms. Anderson swallowed. Down the hall, Malik waited with a small group of students as teachers whispered urgently into phones. He felt strangely calm now, as if the fear had burned itself out and left clarity behind. He understood something now that he hadn't before. The danger hadn't started when people laughed. It had started when they stopped listening. And somewhere beyond these walls Whatever had followed his father's truth into the school was no longer hiding. It was watching, and it knew it had been seen. The lockdown announcement came without warning. Not a siren, not shouting, just the calm, practiced voice of the principal over the intercom, to steady, to be comforting. Attention faculty and students, we are initiating a precautionary safety protocol. Please remain in your current classrooms. Teachers, secure your doors. For half a second, no one reacted. Then chairs scraped, bags dropped. Parents looked at one another, confusion flickering across faces that were used to certainty, used to control. Ms. Anderson moved on instinct. She crossed the room and turned the lock, her fingers stiff, the metallic click echoing far too loudly. She lowered the blinds halfway, not all the way. She didn't know why she stopped herself. Maybe because fully closing them felt like admitting something was wrong. This is just a precaution, she said, turning back to the room. Everyone please stay calm. Her voice sounded unfamiliar to her own ears. Malik sat perfectly still. He had noticed something the moment the announcement began. Not the words, but the timing. The way it came seconds after his tablet had gone silent. The way his father had left the room with men who didn't look like school staff. He leaned toward Ethan. Don't move unless a teacher tells you, he whispered. Ethan blinked. What? Just don't. Ms. Anderson watched Malik. Now, really watched him, not as a student, as a variable, a father at the Pentagon, security officers in the hallway, a sudden lockdown. Pieces she hadn't wanted to connect were forcing themselves together. Outside the classroom, footsteps moved quickly past the door, purposeful, controlled, not panicked. A shadow paused at the narrow window. Ms. Anderson's breath caught. The shadow moved on, across the building. Jonathan Carter stood in a converted office near the main entrance, eyes fixed on a digital map projected onto the wall. Red markers pulsed across the layout of the school. They've already breached the internal network. An agent said, camera loops, door access. They're probing response times. Jonathan's jaw tightened. They're not here for the system. No, the agent agreed. They're here for leverage. Jonathan didn't need to ask what that meant. He was already moving. Back in the classroom, the air grew heavier by the minute. Parents whispered urgently to one another. One father stood, pacing, his composure cracking. My daughter is in the East Wing, he said. I'm not staying here. Ms. Anderson stepped in front of him without thinking. Sit down, she said sharply. The authority in her voice surprised them both. This is not negotiable. She added, steadier now. If you leave, you put everyone at risk. The man hesitated, then slowly sat. Malik felt it then, a shift, not in the room, but in Ms. Anderson. She was afraid, and fear stripped away pretense. A sudden bang echoed from somewhere deep in the building. Not an explosion, something heavier. Metal against metal. Several parents gasped. Ms. Anderson's hand flew to her mouth before she could stop. Malik slid out of his chair and moved closer to her desk. Ms. Anderson, he said quietly. She looked down at him, startled by the calm in his voice. If someone comes to the door, Malik continued, don't open it unless they say your full name first. Her mouth opened, closed. Why would you? My dad taught me, Malik said, about drills that aren't drills. The room went very still. Another sound followed, voices this time, raised, urgent, then silence again. Ms. Anderson felt something inside her break, not loudly, but completely. The belief that she had been in control, the belief that her classroom was insulated from the world beyond it. She crouched slightly so she was level with Malik. Is your father involved in this? Malik nodded once. And you knew? I didn't know everything, he said, but I knew enough. Ms. Anderson straightened slowly. For the first time since Malik had walked into her class months ago, she saw him clearly, not as a child reaching beyond his place, but as someone who had been living with truths she had never bothered to imagine. A knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps. Ms. Anderson's heart slammed against her ribs. Ms. Anderson, a voice called from the other side. Calm, male, controlled, federal agents, please open the door. She looked at Malik. He nodded. She opened it. 2 agents stood there, eyes scanning the room before anything else. We're moving this group now, one said. Follow instructions exactly. As the class began to stand, Malik confirmed what he already felt in his bones. This was no longer about disbelief. The truth had arrived, and it was demanding everyone reckon with what they had chosen not to see. They were led into the hallway in silence, not the ordinary, restless silence of students being told to line up, but a deeper one, the kind shaped by fear and obedience. Parents clutched their children's shoulders, shoes squeaked against polished floors that suddenly felt too long, too exposed. Every classroom door they passed was shut tight, blinds drawn, teachers standing guard like sentries who hadn't been trained for war. Malik walked near the front of the group, flanked by Ms. Anderson and an agent whose hand never strayed far from the radio. Clipped to his belt, she noticed everything now. The way Malik's eyes tracked corners before they turned them, the way he listened more than he spoke. They reached the main corridor. That was when the shouting started, not panicked screams, commands. Sharp, urgent, overlapping. Someone was running. The sound echoed hard off the walls. Bouncing closer. Stop moving, one of the agents ordered. Instantly, the group froze. Ms. Anderson felt her knees weaken. She reached out without thinking and rested her hand on Malik's shoulder. It startled her how solid he felt, grounded, like a fixed point in a room that had lost its balance. From the far end of the hall, a man in a maintenance uniform burst into view. At first glance, he looked ordinary, middle-aged, hunched slightly, clutching a tool bag. But the illusion lasted only a heartbeat. His eyes were wrong, too alert, too calculating, and when he saw the agents, he didn't hesitate. He ran, suspect moving. An agent shouted. Everything fractured at once. The man dropped the tool bag mid-stride. It hit the floor with a heavy thud that made several parents cry out. Two agents sprinted after him, weapons drawn, but held low, disciplined. Another agent shoved the group backward, back into the classroom. Now, they turned to slowly. A second figure emerged from a side corridor, cutting them off. Ms. Anderson's breath left her in a thin gasp. This one wasn't running. He was walking, calm, measured, confident. He wore a dark coat despite the warmth of the building, his posture upright, his gaze sweeping the group like an inventory. When his eyes landed on Malik, they lingered a fraction too long. Malik felt it, the same way you feel eyes on your back before you turn around. Jonathan Carter came around the corner at a run. Malik, the sound of his father's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through cloth. The man in the dark coat reacted instantly, his hand diving into his jacket. Down. Jonathan shouted. Malik didn't think. He moved. He grabbed Ethan's sleeve and dropped, pulling him hard to the floor as Ms. Anderson fell with them. Covering instinctively, a gunshot cracked through the hall, deafening, sharp, final. The bullet shattered a light fixture above where they'd been standing seconds earlier. Screams erupted. Agents returned fire in controlled bursts, driving the man backward. He stumbled, clipped in the shoulder, crashing into the wall before dropping to his knees. Another agent tackled him, wrenching his arms behind his back. Secure him, someone yelled. The hallway filled with shouting, radios blaring, boots pounding. Jonathan was already at Malik's side. He dropped to one knee, gripping Malik's face in his hands, searching for blood, for injury, for anything wrong. Are you hit? No, Malik said, breathless but steady. I moved when you said my name. Jonathan pulled him into his chest, holding him there for a beat longer than professionalism allowed. Ms. Anderson watched the scene unfold from the floor, her heart hammering. This was no misunderstanding, no exaggeration, no child's fantasy. This was the world Malik had been telling her about, the world she had smiled at. An agent approached Jonathan, voice low but urgent. Sir, we believe this was an attempted extraction. They knew where to find him. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Then the perimeter failed. We're locking it down now. Jonathan nodded once, then stood, placing himself between Malik and the rest of the hall without even thinking about it. Ms. Anderson pushed herself up slowly, her hands trembling. I'm sorry, she said, the words spilling out raw and unpolished. I didn't know. I didn't believe him. Jonathan looked at her, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something colder. That's the problem, he said. You didn't have to know. The agents began moving everyone again, faster this time, more urgently. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. As Malik was escorted away, he looked back once. At the shattered light, at the man in handcuffs, at Ms. Anderson standing frozen in the hallway, her certainty in ruins. And Malik understood something, then something heavy and permanent. The truth hadn't just walked into the room. It had drawn fire. And nothing would ever be the same again. The safe area was the gymnasium, but it didn't feel safe. Rows of students sat cross-legged on the polished floor. Parents clustered near the walls. Phones clutched uselessly in their hands. Armed officers stood at every exit now, faces hard, scanning constantly. The cheerful banners hanging from the ceiling, excellence, tradition, integrity, felt like artifacts from another lifetime. Malik sat on the lowest bleacher with Ethan beside him. His father stood a few steps away, speaking in low tones with men and women who all carried themselves the same way he did, alert, restrained, dangerous in a quiet, disciplined way. Ms. Anderson stood alone near the free throw line, that no clipboard, no smile, no script. Her hands trembled slightly, and she didn't bother hiding it anymore. For the first time in her career, she had no idea what to say. She replayed the past week with merciless clarity, the indulgent smile, the pointed questions, the way she had framed disbelief as pedagogy. She had thought she was correcting a child. She had been silencing one, and that silence had nearly cost him his life. Jonathan finished speaking with the agents and turned toward Malik. Instantly, Ms. Anderson straightened, dread pooling in her stomach. This was the moment, she realized. Not the gunshot, not the arrest, the reckoning. Jonathan walked to Malik first, crouching to speak quietly to him. Malik nodded, eyes steady, far steadier than any child should have been required to be. Then Jonathan stood and faced the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. What happened today, he said calmly, was not an accident. A murmur rippled through the parents. The individuals apprehended were part of a foreign intelligence operation. Jonathan continued. Their objective was to exploit what they believed was a soft target. A mother gasped. Someone whispered. A school. Yes, Jonathan said, answering the question without looking at them. A school. Because people assume schools are beyond the reach of real danger. His eyes shifted briefly, deliberately to Ms. Anderson. They also rely on something else, he went on. Assumptions. About who matters. About who is credible. About which voices are safe to ignore. The silence deepened. Ms. Anderson felt every word like a weight pressing down on her chest. They were able to get close, Jonathan said, because no one believed my son when he spoke plainly about his life. A few parents looked down. Others looked at Malik for the first time, without judgment. He wasn't bragging, Jonathan said. He wasn't lying. He wasn't confused. He was telling the truth in a room that decided the truth was inconvenient. Ms. Anderson's knees nearly gave out. She stepped forward before she could stop herself. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice breaking. I was wrong. Every head turned. She swallowed hard. I believed I was teaching discernment. But what I was really doing was protecting my own assumptions. I saw a child who didn't match the story I expected, and I chose disbelief over curiosity. Her voice shook now. I am so sorry. Jonathan studied her for a long moment. Then he said, apologies matter. Accountability matters more. The words were not cruel. They were final. The principal approached, pale and visibly shaken. We will be conducting a full review, he said quickly, of procedures, of staff conduct, of good. Jonathan interrupted, because today exposed more than a security failure. He looked around the gym, at the parents, at the teachers, at the children who had learned something none of them should have had to learn so young. It exposed how easily truth is dismissed when it comes from the wrong voice. Ms. Anderson felt tears sting her eyes, not from humiliation, but from recognition. She had spent her life believing herself fair, objective, enlightened, and yet, when a black boy stood in front of her and spoke his reality, she had smiled and waited for him to be quiet. Malik felt something shift inside him, not triumph, not anger, but release. He had been heard, not because danger had arrived, but because danger had revealed what disbelief could cost. As emergency vehicles continued to arrive outside and agents coordinated next steps, Jefferson Academy stood forever changed. The illusion of insulation of privilege as protection had shattered, and in its place stood a simple, uncomfortable truth. The greatest threat had not been the man with the gun. It had been the moment when the truth was laughed at and believed too late. The gymnasium slowly emptied, but the silence stayed. Parents signed forms with shaking hands. Children were released in small groups, escorted by officers who spoke gently but watched everything. Outside, flashing lights painted the schools, brick walls in red and blue, turning Jefferson Academy into something unrecognizable, a place no longer protected by reputation or money, only by vigilance. Malik walked beside his father, their shoulders nearly touching. Jonathan hadn't let go of him since the incident, not physically, not really. Every few steps, his father's hand brushed Malik's back, a quiet check, a promise without words. Ms. Anderson watched them from across the room. For the first time since she had entered teaching, she didn't feel like the authority in the space. She felt like a witness, one who had arrived late to the truth and would carry that lateness for the rest of her life. Malik. He stopped when she called his name. Jonathan turned instantly, body angling just slightly in front of his son before he realized what he was doing. Ms. Anderson noticed the instinct, the protection, the love sharpened by danger. Yes, Malik asked. She took a step forward, then another. Her voice was quiet now, stripped of performance. I want you to know, she said, that I will never again confuse disbelief with wisdom. Malik considered her carefully. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. Okay, he said. The simplicity of it hit her harder than anger ever could. Jonathan placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. We're leaving, he said politely. Outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. A black SUV waited near the curb, unmistakably official now, its presence no longer something to be questioned or laughed at. Malik paused at the steps and looked back at the school. The banners were still there. Excellence, tradition, integrity. He wondered how long it would take before those words meant something different to the people inside. As the car pulled away, Jefferson Academy receded into the distance, no longer a fortress of certainty, but a place marked by what it had failed to see. At home that night, Malik sat on his bed while his father checked the locks, the windows, the perimeter. The house felt smaller than it had before, safer but changed. Dad, Malik said quietly. Jonathan turned. Yeah, are people always going to watch us now? Jonathan thought carefully before answering. Not always, he said, but sometimes. Malik nodded. I think I understand now. Jonathan sat beside him. Understand what? That telling the truth doesn't always protect you, Malik said, but not telling it doesn't either. Jonathan smiled faintly. That's very accurate. There was a pause. They laughed at me, Malik said, but they stopped. Jonathan looked at his son, really looked at him, the calm where fear had tried to live, the strength that had formed under pressure no child should bear. They didn't stop because I walked into the room, Jonathan said. They stopped because you stood there first. Malik absorbed that in silence. Later, when the house was quiet and Malik was asleep, Jonathan stood by the window, watching. The street, the world beyond it, was still dangerous, still full of people who would underestimate, dismiss, exploit. But it had also revealed something else. Truth had weight, and even when ignored, it left marks. Back at Jefferson Academy, the lights burned late into the night. Meetings were held, reports written, decisions delayed, then forced. The school would issue statements, apologies, committees, but none of it would erase the moment a child told the truth and the room chose not to believe him. And that lesson would linger longer than any security protocol, because the most dangerous assumption of all had finally been exposed, that the truth needs permission to be real. It doesn't. It only needs someone brave enough to say it, and someone willing, finally, to listen.